Welcome to the Prof Talk Pod, brought to you by the Engaged Professor. Every 2 weeks, join us as we talk about tips and tricks to help you connect with your students, engage with industry, and stay up to date on all the teaching trends. We'll give you actionable strategies that will help improve your teaching today. Thank you for being here. Let's get started. Hello, welcome to the Prof Talk Pod. My name is Becky Aiken, and I am host of the Prof Talk Pod, which is brought to you by the Engaged Professor. I am currently a professor of the practice at the University of Kansas, and joining me this week is Galen Clavio, as he always does. Hi, Galen. How's your semester going?
It's half over. It's week 8. So it's going pretty well, I would say, at this point, because it's half over.
Yeah, I can't believe that. I looked at my schedule and I was like, oh, okay. So then spring break happens. And I don't know if this happens to you, but the spring gets a little wild. Once spring break happens, all of a sudden the semester is over and I don't know what happened.
The same thing happens here, and it's worse at Indiana, worse in quotes. It's not actually worse, but we have this thing that happens every spring known as the Little 500, which, a long time ago acquired the moniker of world's greatest college weekend, even though it's really like a 2-week thing. And I always tell our incoming faculty, spring, it feels like a slog. Then you get to spring break, and that's week 9, basically, or week 10 in this week. So then you come back, you've only got 5 weeks left, but you've really only got 2 weeks left, because when April rolls around in Bloomington, people are not focusing on class. And so it really does compress things in a way. And we're just getting ready for that at this stage here.
Yeah, that's a lot going on. And also it's March. So if you've listened before, both Gail and I are sports faculty in a previous life. And so we both love sports and we both love college basketball. We also happen to work at two of the historically successful institutions in college basketball. So March is also just kind of a crazy fast month because of March Madness.
Yeah, I did my first bracket projection yesterday. I've taken to waiting till March because it's like you got 2-3 weeks. What are you doing? So yeah, I'm glad you emphasized historical powers, because neither of our programs exactly living up to their billing this season, but still a lot to look forward to. And I will, as we did last year at IACS, we'll just sit and watch tournament games, even if neither of our teams are involved in it, because it is that blessed of a year. But it does take extra time off your calendar.
That is for sure. So I appreciate y'all for listening to us today. Actually, today's topic comes from a meeting I was sitting in, just a general faculty meeting. We were talking about some of the things going on in our department. And at the end, my supervisor had introduced this consortium that KU was a part of that was trying to explore the use of generative AI in higher education. And as we were talking about this with the faculty meeting, there was some discussion about, of course, like usual, what we are all doing in our classrooms, how we're approaching it with our students. And we were trying to figure out what KU's purpose was for kind of joining the consortium. And, it wasn't said that we were looking to create a university-wide AI policy, but that was certainly one of the things that faculty were asking questions about. And that got me thinking about whether it would be a good idea for universities to have a university wide AI policy. And of course, that meant I went looking to see what was out there. And there are a couple out there, Columbia being one of them. And so I read through theirs. It really covers things like personal information and private data, how, what you should and should not be putting into these models, what you're allowed to use or approved for use, how to get access to it. If you are a Microsoft school, if you have Microsoft Office, you might have Copilot as part of that. We do at KU. But there were a couple of things I thought was interesting about it. They obviously encourage faculty to have a statement, but it says without a specific instructor policy, student use is prohibited, which I would be willing to guess that even this far in, we still have, 50% of faculty that do not have a generative AI policy in their syllabus. I found a couple others out there, like Hofstra, Notre Dame, have listed on website university-wide policies, most of which is focused on how faculty use them in the classroom, not a lot on how faculty use them themselves or staff use them. And so it was something that was kind of on my mind. I don't know at IU, Galen, is that something you all have talked about, or does the university have some guidance on it? We have guidance from our, teaching and learning center on
Yeah.
using it in our classroom, but not university wide policy that I've seen.
Yeah, no, there's nothing in terms of a campus-wide policy here right now. And I am for one glad for that, because I think with what I teach or have taught and the things that I administer now, which are all media related, you can't just ban AI. I mean, AI is already a key element of the creative process, of the generative process, and it's a tool. It's not necessarily. I think a lot. My big reaction a lot of times, and when I've been asked for like, "What's your AI policy?" and it's like, well, we really have to take it on a case by case basis in media, because it's not just a way to cheat, which I think is how it's viewed in a lot of other circles of academia. And my philosophy on it is, if the concern is that students aren't doing their own work, that's a legitimate concern. But I think sometimes there's a lot of grandstanding that happens in higher ed, where it's like, we're going to ban this thing because it's not, it runs counter to our values. And then everybody else starts using it. You put your students at a disadvantage. You actively dissuade them from using something that they may need in their career pathways, with the idea that, well, you need to learn how to do all this stuff manually. This is an inarticulate comp, and I acknowledge that it's not a perfect comp, but it's kind of like, when was the calculator introduced? The calculator made it so you weren't doing mathematical equations by hand. Did that mean that you shouldn't use it? Should we have banned the calculator because it was harming people's ability to do math by themselves? Well, we all would think that that's silly at this point. It's really about, okay, here's this computer aided tool that's allowing you to do something in a different, more efficient way. And hey, guess what? Everybody in the professional world is going to be using that. So again, like, I'm glad that we don't have a policy that's campus wide right now. And I do worry at some of the places that do have it. It's like, I'm not sure if you're actually doing your students a service by taking such an ironclad stance on something that we're still learning about and that is still being developed.
Well, you said something in there that I think is really important, which is in the media program. I mean, there's use for it. It's being used in industry, same thing in marketing. And one of the challenges, if you have a university-wide policy, is our disciplines are different.
Yeah.
And what makes sense in one won't necessarily make sense in another. And it's hard to create a blanket policy in a very diverse environment, which higher ed tends to be a very diverse environment. And that really makes it difficult. And I know you and I have talked about this before. You probably have students use it in different ways or not use it in different ways, depending on the level of the class or the class you're actually teaching. And I was talking to one of the other faculty at KU, and he actually sent me after the discussion. I had sent an email and I was like, I really hope we're not going to have a university wide policy. I don't think that's a great idea. And he had sent me an email back that talked about and sent me his statement that was different in his different classes based on the year that they are in school and the things he's trying to get them to be able to do. So, if you need memorization, I could see where you would have a policy that's a little stricter about use because you need students to memorize the muscles in the body.
Yeah.
But in a program that's about creation, these tools are used in creation. So you almost need to allow it. And I think that's one of the problems is that even the same instructor
Right.
might have a different policy for a different class. So think about trying to do that at university wide. Sounds pretty challenging at best.
It's certainly a tough spot, because there's, to some degree, I think, and we've talked about this in other parts of the professorial experience before, but because a lot of professors have a tendency in their classes to put them on autopilot after they've prepped them the first time, there's a resistance to changing the way you're assessing things or changing assignments or changing readings, because after a while you got to focus on research, or you're focusing on other classes that you're teaching. you're going to be like, well, I've already set this class the way that it needs to be taught, in my opinion. What AI, and generative AI in particular on the writing side does is it makes it so that you can't just give people the same old essay questions, because it's easy to answer those questions in essay form via chat GPT or something similar, and it's a lot of work to retask all of those things, and you can't really tell the difference unless you're really looking for the difference. Now, a lot of students are dumb with the way they use this, and they'll just whole cloth copy things without noting that there are little telltale signs that are included in the text. It's very low effort, but I think a lot of the resistance from faculty when you get through the we students need to learn things to do things by themselves. A lot of what I see is actually a lack of desire to go in and change the way you're assessing, because you've gotten used to just giving people blue book exams or giving people like written things and having them go and do it because they're easy for you to grade. If that's no longer an effective assessment, you got to find more interactive or more like media rich ways of creating assignments. And not a lot of people want to do that. So it's like, well, it's easier to just ban the thing that is creating the problem, but that doesn't really solve the problem. It just puts it off a little bit.
Well, and I mean, as we know, I'm teaching about levers of influence right now. And when you tell people they can't do things, what do they want to do? Do
Yeah.
the thing
Yep.
every time.
It's very
So
much a consistent thing that we see in human psychology. It's
yeah,
fascinating.
yes, it's like literally how our brains work. So, and if you've been a parent, you've seen that so many times. So, I think that's interesting though, because so I don't know that there's a lot of likelihood that in the next academic year we will see university-wide policies where it says this is how you have to apply it in your program. Now, I do see those in other types of policies like excused absences, for example. We have an excused absence policy at KU. If students are gone for one of those reasons in the policy, you have to excuse them whether your perception is that is a valid excuse to miss class or not. Now, it's not like for everything, but there's a pretty long list at KU. And those things are difficult to apply. On top of, we have university-wide plagiarism and academic integrity policies that govern the way that we do things. I could see 3 or so or more years down the road, maybe less,
Yeah.
universities saying we have to have university-wide because we need consistency in how these things are being done in our classrooms. And I just don't know how that will work. Maybe somewhat like academic integrity policies where people know they're there and they put them in their syllabi, but I know plenty of faculty who have suspected students of cheating and never reported it through the formal channels. So
Right.
maybe it will end up being something like that. I'm not sure what that looks like.
Well, I mean, my thing is this, like, again, this is new, relatively new technology. Now, there are some moral and ethical quandaries around the way that the AA models are being built, but those are things we're kind of struggling with on a nationwide level and even an international level.
Yeah.
So I am not, my philosophy has always been this. If when something new comes along, let's not react in fear when it's giving us the kinds of quandaries in terms of like something simple like assignments or wow, our students aren't doing the work. Let's dive in and try to figure out, all right, has the world changed, and are we just in I mean, this is my big thing right now. Like, there's so much emphasis from faculty because faculty are older than students. I mean, I don't know what the average faculty member's age is, but most people who are on faculty are going to be over 35, and in many cases, they're over 55. And they all come from an era where they were expected to write, they were expected to do a particular type of schoolwork that was all predicated on the idea that that you couldn't fake writing out the answer. Well, now you can. So does that change the way we teach, and does it change the way that we instruct students about how to bring material in? And also, again, if we're trying to train, like, this is where to some degree the I think higher ed, at least in the United States, runs smack dab into some quandaries about how it's tried to define itself. Like, what's the phraseology we've heard for the last 20 years? Well, we're not training people for jobs. This isn't a vocational school. We're training people how to think. And the presence of generative AI in particular really threatens that order, because in the minds of a lot of faculty, it's like, well, how could you learn how to think if the computer's doing it for you? But it's, to me, it's a different version of, like, the idea of, you use the web as a resource. I remember 20 years ago, it was like, we can't use Wikipedia in research because you can't verify anything. And yet, if you look at Wikipedia, it's become this really well sourced thing where if you teach people how to use Wikipedia, you get thumbnail sketches of a much broader set of information that you go down to the references area, and there's all the readings that you need to find, and there's all the references. So it ends up being a net positive, but it was approached as a net negative because it was, in many people were like, we're not going to teach how to use the tool is bad, when in fact the tool was probably good. It was just that you needed to take the effort to incorporate it into how students were learning and how they were putting that information out there. The computers and computers think and can connect to information. Think is the wrong word. They can be programmed to access information much more quickly. They can be programmed to identify patterns that we can't. And you already see AI being used in ways that are very good at, you know, uh, bringing information together and presenting it in cogent fashion. Not too different from textbooks, Becky. Like, this is kind of how I look at AI. It's like, here's a textbook chapter. Is that where you'd want to stop with your knowledge? No, but it might open your mind up to things that you wouldn't know otherwise. But you have to design assignments and learning processes around that, not treat it as an outside agent.
Well, and I could see why on the policy side, there's a concern that there won't be original thought or new thought if we don't help people understand how you take textbook knowledge, think about it, apply it, and then expand or build on it. I can see that, and I still don't let my students use Wikipedia as a source, but I tell them it's a great place to go to find sources. And
Yeah.
then, of course, you have to teach people how to vet sources, and I think that's such a good analogy there that I wasn't expecting, that, it was a tool, not that we could teach people to use, and generative AI is the same way, and so when we look at policy from a university standpoint, I'm not sure, as you've said a couple times, these tools are evolving. What we have now won't look the same. Even where ChatGPT was 2.5 years ago is nowhere near where it is now. I use it every day and I'm having a hard time keeping up with this capabilities and the different models and the different tools within. And that's just one generative AI tool, right? It's just one LLM. And I think that for universities, that evolution is going to make it hard to pin something down. Now, I will say that it's important that we at least think about, there are some pros to having a university wide policy. Probably the main one that I see when I work with students in my classes, because I have a very pro AI approach in the courses that I teach, is, there's a constant confusion about what classes I can do what in. And it's very, I think, difficult sometimes for students to manage somebody like me who's saying, let's use the tool. This is required in this assignment for you to use this tool to summarize your interview with your professional that you did.
Right.
And then balance that with, another professor who says, if you use it at all, it's plagiarism. I'm going to, report you to the university code of conduct. And I think that's a lot for students to manage, and it's changing every semester. I'm not saying it's impossible for them, but I can see where having a university-wide policy might help students be less confused and have some more consistent standards. I just don't know that it's I don't know that those pros outweigh the potential negatives and the challenges that come with university-wide policy.
Yeah, that's my big thing, is like, there's certain things we have university wide policies on, but most of them are around very easy to understand things like plagiarism. And I don't think it's a very easy to understand area. I would be upset if the English department was like, we need to ban AI. And I'm over here in the media school saying we need to be able to use AI because we're not properly preparing our students moving forward if they're not using it. So I I, I think eventually some kind of school wide policy, or campus wide policy makes sense. I just don't think we're there yet. And I think, as the space, and I'm somewhat familiar with it. it's going to keep evolving. You're going to get new players in the game. You're going to get new methodologies by which this stuff's being used. It's very embryonic right now. I would just say, clear, like, a lot of the negative aspects of AI usage are already covered in your existing plagiarism statutes. Why add something specific for AI when you A, can't police it, and B, it kind of feels like you're only doing it so you can feel better about yourself. And I don't think that that's a good reason to set policy.
Well, that's a great point. That is not a good reason to set policy. I think that's a fair assessment. And, just one last thought there. I think what you just said makes a lot of sense is that, we didn't talk much about academic freedom, but that is something that's really important to faculty and something that we're all feeling more threatened now than we might have in recent years. And so when you start to tell us how we can work with things in our classroom, we start to think, well, wait a second, I have the freedom to do what I think is necessary. And I think that's one of the things you just said is that initial faculty reaction might be, no, 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 another department doesn't need to be the biggest voice. And we don't want to bring politics into this kind of policy either, in terms of like who has more clout or influence on campus being the one to set this when it might not work
Right.
for everyone. So, as we think about steps forward, because I think that's something that we try to do when we come to the end of each episode, what I would say is most important is to actually reach out and talk about policies. Your centers for teaching and learning, or whatever, teaching excellence, whatever they're called on your campus, might have a way to do that. But I would reach out to your colleagues who teach in other departments that maybe you've met through university service, and ask them about their policies and talk through it with people who have different perspectives than you, so that you can help expand the way that you're thinking about your policy. And if it's not started at your university, especially small ones, it would be good to have some sort of like repository where we can see the different policies that people have, and take and borrow, because we're all kind of fumbling our way through this.
Right.
And if you haven't even started thinking about it yet, it can be overwhelming. So start doing that now. And then the next thing that I think is important is thinking about how you assess the effectiveness of the policy or the way that you're using generative AI in your classes. Ultimately, at some point, we aren't going to know what's
Yeah.
AI and what isn't, because it's going to be integrated into things that we do, into the tools we use, and we won't even know that it's happening
Yeah.
in the background. For now, we're not there yet, so we still kind of need to work through what to do in terms of our individual classrooms.
I agree with all that. The one thing I would add is don't just talk to those people, but talk to the professionals, the alumni that you have that are working in fields that your students are going into. Because there's few areas emerging right now that are less aligned in terms of how academia is likely to view them versus how business is likely to view them than AI. Most businesses are looking at AI and saying this is great. We can be more efficient. We can ask our employees to do different things. If you're making policy based upon what your fellow faculty members are thinking, and you're not factoring in what your students, who, whether or not you want to admit you're preparing them for careers, you are preparing them for careers. Go look at the literature on your own website, or your own admissions pages, and you'll see that. To not consider utilizing something because you yourself have a moral problem with it, without considering the impact that might have on your students, could be disastrous. So I'm just saying, at least factor that into the equation. It doesn't have to be the end all be all, but you need to be able to explain, if you're banning something, why that approach is out of alignment with how the professional world is viewing that thing and using that thing, because you don't want to be in a situation where you're depriving your students of something that they need.
Well, and along with that, just a final thought, because that's an excellent point. If you are at a university that's exploring university-wide policy and you have an ear to suggest this to, tell them the same thing. If we are going to create this policy, we need to talk to professionals working not just in business, but scientists working in industry, right? To talk to people before we set a policy that's going to impact students that will eventually be in those careers.
You got it.
Cool. Well, thank you all for listening. Please subscribe, share this with a friend if you think it might be useful. We appreciate you being here, and we will see you next time.